What makes a good poem? In fact, what makes a great poem? Well, that is the question for our episode this week. And the title of our episode is How to Judge a Poem. How to Judge a Poem, Finding the Language We Love and Need. Which means you are listening to Poetry, Gossip, and the Pursuit of Pleasure with Dale Byron. Of course, that's me. And in this podcast, we explore creative and practical ways to use poetry in our everyday lives. As I like to say, we're finding little pockets of joy, sanity, and connectedness in the poetry. So let's jump right in. What does make a good poem? What makes a good poem or a great poem? Well, on one level, I have no idea because it's so subjective, but I know what a good poem is for me. I know what a good poem looks like and smells like. I know the length. I know the shocks and the tugs that I look for inside the poem. If I'm going to call that poem a favorite, if it's going to really be one that I go back to time and time again. And I know the residual taste of that poem that must be left with me after the poem is enjoyed, is encountered, is consumed, if you want to use that word. But let's be clear. Let's be clear. I want to really make this point. Every poem is a miracle. Any poem is a miracle. And yet, some poems rise to the level of art for each of us. And my point here is that I'm really talking about for me. And that's the subjective part. Do I mean that a poem is bad if subjectively it's not for me? Of course I don't. Others may love the poem, but I have some simple rules, and the reason that I'm really I wanted to cover this today, that I wanted to have an episode about how to judge a poem, is because maybe you won't like or you won't relate to the same criteria that I have. Maybe you will relate to other criteria. Maybe I will inspire you to create your own kind of template for the poems you're looking for the poems that become your favorite, that become your life preserver poems, I call them. These, what I'm going to talk about today, is just to give you an idea about the kinds of ways, the template I use, and the kind of things that I think about in terms of the poems that I love. And again, maybe you'll relate to this, or maybe you will create your own. But anyway, I hope it helps. So essentially, it's my criteria, my way of looking at poems. It's really very simple. 3 words. A poem for me that is going to be attractive, that I am much more likely to care about and even love, is if it's short, if it is surprising, and if it's satisfying. Short, I mean, that's the easy one. In fact, somebody once said that if you write a short poem, or if you find a short poem, it just has a lot more chance of being great for obvious reasons. The second is surprising. Now, I think that one of the essential characteristics of a good poem, of a great poem, of a masterpiece, is for it to surprise you, for it to give you a kind of moment. And that's that moment where we are really most connected, I think, where we are most alive. And that surprise is where we're learning. It's where we're having feelings. So that's the second incredibly important criteria. I need a really good tug, a shock, a surprise. And as I've said many times before on this podcast, it's not just when you're writing poems. Those of you who, and I know there are some who follow this podcast that are also write poetry, and the great poet or a great poet once said, if the writer is not surprised, then surely the reader will not be either. And I love that quote. And but the point is, it talks about that even when we're writing, we are looking for surprise, to surprise ourselves. So, and then the last one is satisfying. And that really means that it has some purpose. It helps me remember something important. It helps me grieve. It helps me dig further into joy. It helps me appreciate something. There's a lot of different ways that I think a poem can be satisfying, but it needs to have that kind of residual effect. So let's dive right in with our first poem. And remember our criteria, and we're going to keep coming back to it because this is a way to look at poetry and a way, quite frankly, to judge poetry. And yes, let's do it. This poem is called, it's got a very surprising title, actually, and a provocative title. The poet is Marie Howe, and the poem is called My Dead Friends. My Dead Friends. And it goes like this. I have begun. I have begun when I am weary. I have begun when I'm weary and can't decide an answer to a bewildering question, to ask my dead friends for their opinion. And the answer is often immediate and clear. Should I take the job? Should I take the job, move to the city? Should I try to conceive a child in my middle age? They stand in unison. They stand in unison, shaking their heads and smiling. Whatever leads to joy, whatever leads to joy, they always answer. To more life and less worry, whatever leads to joy, they always answer. To more life and less worry. I look into the vase where Billy's ashes were. It's green in there, a green vase. And I ask Billy if I should return the difficult phone call. And he says, yes, yes. Billy's already gone through the frightening door. Billy's already gone through the frightening door. Whatever he says, I'll do. Billy's already gone through the frightening door. Whatever he says, I'll do. That's Marie Howe. The poem is short, of course. That's the easiest way. We can know that right off the bat. By the way, while I'm thinking about it, even long poems, really like the prelude or long poems like the Howl or just Walt Whitman, Leaves of Grass. Even long poems, you can pull sections of the poem that are shorter that you love. So I just want you to know that it doesn't have to exclude long poems. And no, it's not that I hate all long poems. It's just that this is my criteria for my first aid for my favorite poems. And this one it meets the first one because it's relatively short. The surprising part for me, the way it ends, and the way the whole context that the protagonist is using in this poem about asking her dead friends for answers. To me, the whole thing is just a pattern interrupt. So there's surprises all the way through this poem, and then satisfying. Yes, I find that this poem, and I've only known about this poem for a short while, but I find it a poem that's satisfying for me so that I love to go back and read it again and again. And what's interesting is that's another criteria for satisfying, is that if you find yourself attracted to reading a poem more than once, and if it's a favorite poem, of course, that's going to be the case. But that would be, for me, a satisfying poem. Now, Marie Howe was born in Rochester, New York. She's an American poet, won all kind of awards, and was in 2012 was the state poet of New York. So she's just got all kinds of awards and just a wonderful poet. Find her poems. Last name is Howe, and you will not be disappointed. Okay, so remember, short, surprising, and satisfying. That's just the map. And it's, again, it's one map. It's my map that I use. And maybe you want to take it on and just see if you like it. Or maybe, as we've already said, it'll spur you on to create your own map for poems that you love. So let's dive right into our second poem by Kate Clanchy, Clanchy, Clanchy. And this poem is called Double Take, Double Take, Double Take. I imagined that you'd miss me. I imagined that you'd missed me. Thought you'd pace your hardwood floor in odd worn socks. Watch the clock sit stuck. Get late to work, get late to work. Type my name, caps, lock press, and hold shift break. Miss buses, meals, or sit with fork halfway. Lost for minutes, hours. Sleep badly, late. Dream chases, shake, send fingers out to pad the pillow. Find my hollow, start awake, roll over, hug a gap, an ache. Take a walk. Damp dawn, of course, wrapped in a mac with the collar up. Glimpse a slice of face, tap a stranger's back. Draw a blank, as I have each time I run to press your face to mine, shining with imagined rain. Just want to take a deep breath after a poem like that. Interestingly enough, poems which appeal to us, and this one does me, and I hope these do for you, of course, as well, is that they have a way of, and I've talked about this before, inviting us in. They are not overly or overtly clear. Too much clarity is a kind of an insult to the reader, because the reader wants to step inside and have their own experience. They want to, in a way, finish the piece of art, the poem, because it's not finished, it's not complete until the reader steps inside, until we step inside the poem and have our own experience. Because that is how a poem is made our own. That is how a poem becomes one of our favorites. I love the way, she says toward the end of the poem, she's talking about all these things that I imagine you would have or be doing. Take a walk, damp dawn, of course, wrapped in a mac with the collar up, must be some kind of coat. Glimpse a slice of face, tap a stranger's back, draw a blank, as I have each time I run to press your face to mine, shining with imagined rain. Again, it's almost like they talk about certain poems move so fast and they're so dizzying that it's like, when you step into the shower, you don't sit there and wait for each drop and say, okay, that drop's going to go there, that drop's going to, no, you just stand there and you get wet in that delicious, hot, warm, or whatever shower. And same way with a poem like this. We don't need to stop and analyze every word. We know what's going on in this poem. We know that a heart's been broken. We know that tears are being shed. We know it's a love that is no longer happening. So it allows us to have this imagination about when our hearts have been broken, when the loves that we've had in our own lives, when things didn't work out, and how we felt when that occurred. So, is it short? Yes. Is it surprising? I absolutely think it's surprising. And I particularly the end. And of course, that's usually when the big surprise is delivered to us. When she says, each time I run to press your face to mine, shining with imagined rain. And of course, we get that scene. We really get that scene. And it's a kind of surprise and satisfying, yes, in many ways. For me, for me. I hope for you too. Born in Glasgow, the poet Kate Clanchy was born in Glasgow in 1965, educated at George Watson's College in Edinburgh and at the University of Oxford, where she studied English, a teacher, a poet, a writer, a playwright, and with tons of awards. Find her poems. They're great. She's really good. You know, I always say the poets that I feature on this podcast, I am really suggesting and encouraging you to find their books, find their poems, enjoy them. Okay, so back to my point a little bit. Actually, this next poem is one that I wrote some years ago, probably 15 years ago. And the reason I wanted to bring it today is because, again, what the Ezra Pound, the poet I was talking about, says, if the poet is not surprised, then the reader will not be either. And this was a poem. I mean, I think in my own writing, when I feel the most exhilarated with writing, when I love it the most, and I do love the process of writing, but when I love it the most is when I am moving along and there's something, you know, whether you call it the muse or whatever it is, there's something which seems to be delivering something. It's almost like it's just coming through. And in that kind of state, when you get to the end of the poem, often there is a kind of, it's almost like you say, I can't wait till I get to the end of the poem to see how it's going to end, to see what I'm going to say. And this was a feeling that I had with this poem. And yeah, so let's just jump into it. It's called Light Switch. And I've, again, wrote this poem many, many years ago. Light Switch. Flipping on the bathroom light this morning, flipping on the bathroom light this morning, each watt emanating from behind the white frosted glass. I felt a sudden surge. And began to think how wires connect things, heaving houses, pulsing with nerves that mimic our bodies, that mimic the heavens, the way they connect to larger wires, arching out through enormous expanses of air toward the great roadside timbers fitted with coats of creosote to press the bugs into service elsewhere. And back and back and back to the great steel towers standing watch over deserts, forests, hills, vast prairies that have seen civilizations grind themselves slowly away. And mountains filled with ancient snow, mountains made from volcanoes, earthquakes, and the great tectonic plates shifting below, and that snow too that became water, and that water that became river that turned the great turbines into some powerful God that made it all, and the sun too, from which every watt measure of light comes, which is to say, my light switch is wired to eternity. And mountains filled with ancient snow, mountains made from volcanoes, earthquakes, and the great tectonic plates shifting below, and that snow too that became water, and that water became river that turned the great turbines, and to some powerful God that made it all, and the sun too, from which every watt measure of light comes, which is to say, my light switch is wired to eternity. Hmm. Well, the poem is relatively short, a little bit longer than some I write, but relatively short. Short enough, I think. Um, Even as the writer, I was surprised. I had no idea that I was going to end up in the place that I did. That line about my light switch being um, tied to eternity, wired to eternity, was a kind of moment for me, which is, again, just so delicious. And finally, satisfying because I've used this poem to talk about systems theory, as dry and sometimes intellectually bone dry as that can be. But systems theory is so critical to our world today, so critical to all the ecological conundrums and predicaments and challenges we face, that being able to understand systems, how things connect with one another, how great systems work. And I've used this poem as a way to enter into that conversation. So, um, yes, Light Switch is the poem. Okay, as I always say, we're heading for the barn. We've got three little short poems that I think are also, I hope you'll find, indicative of our theme today, which is um, how to judge poems. And again, how to judge poems in a very subjective and loving way, because there's so many poems I read that if I find a poem and it doesn't, if it doesn't click with me, if it doesn't fit one of these criteria, or all of them actually, then it's okay. I'll just put it aside. And I encourage everybody to do that, not to be mean to the poet, not to be mean to the person who wrote the poem. It's just that, maybe other poems they wrote will appeal to you. But the point is that you don't have to suffer through just any, literature in general and poems in particular. You don't have to suffer through those that you don't like, that don't appeal to you. You just don't have to. Just, there's so many poems out there. Find the ones that you love. Okay. So um, these are three, in relative terms, ancient poems. The first one written by Rumi, the other two by Hafez, and which were all amazing poets, still big selling poets, of course, all translated. Rumi, I think, is still the top selling poet in the world. And he hasn't been writing for, I think it's been about 1,200 years since he lived. Basically the same for Hafez, I think. I don't have it in front of me. Anyway, this first one is a translation by Coleman Barks. And what an amazing translator. I had a chance to work with Coleman Barks on a program that we did in San Francisco a number of years ago. He's just a delight. Anyway, this is a poem by Rumi that he translated. It's called Who Makes These Changes? Who makes these changes? And that's how the poem starts. Who makes these changes? I shoot an arrow right. I shoot an arrow right, and it lands left. I ride after a deer and find myself chased by a hog. I plot to get what I want and end up in prison. I plot to get what I want and end up in prison. I dig pits to trap others and fall in. I should be suspicious of what I want. Oh, we all should be suspicious of what we want. Sometimes I say to people, don't get married to an idea just because you came up with it. Or that's what I say to myself. Um, anyway, uh, yes, obviously very short. Um, I think it's incredibly surprising. I think he just pulls the rug out from under us. You know, I dig pits to trap others and fall in. Now, I don't know about you, but I've certainly had very similar experiences. And I should be suspicious, says Rumi, of what I want. It's a beautiful, surprising, elegant, short, and I think satisfying poem. I've also used this poem in a lot of cases to, just to make a lot of obvious things about, that we should hold ourselves a little lighter. We should be a little more humble about our vision. And sometimes, like what's the old adage about be careful what you want, you might get it. Okay, so there we go. Now, the second to the last poem, another little teeny poem, but the rest, these other two are also very short. Um, this is called A Great Need, A Great Need by Hafez. This is the next two poems are translation is done by Daniel Ladinsky, and he's a very well known and accomplished translator. A Great Need, Hafez. Out of a great need, out of a great need, we are all holding hands and climbing. Not loving, not loving is a letting go. Listen, listen, the terrain around here is far too dangerous for that. Obviously short. I think it's wonderfully, has that kind of little surprise to it. And for me, again, very subjective. It's satisfying, but I just love it. Out of a great need, we are holding hands and climbing. Not loving is a letting go, and it would be dangerous. You're climbing up a mountain with others and you're holding hands, protecting each other. Not letting, not loving is a letting go. Listen, listen, the terrain around here is far too dangerous for that. Thank you, Hafez, speaking through hundreds of years to us. And to my ears, it's like this poem could have been written yesterday. Okay, for our last poem in our episode and for this theme today, this poem, again by Hafez, same translator, Ladinsky, and it's called An Astronomical Question. An Astronomical Question. What would happen? What would happen if God leaned down? What would happen if God leaned down and gave you a full wet kiss? Hafez doesn't mind answering astronomical questions like that. You would surely start reciting all day, inebriated, rogue poems like this. Oh, I love it. You would surely, if this happened to you, if God gave you a big wet kiss, you would surely start reciting all day, inebriated, rogue poems like this, like this. I think these poems, one of the other reasons these last three in particular are satisfying is because they have a kind of playfulness to them. And yet, they're talking about very serious things. You know, kind of the first poem talking about ego and how we get in trouble by, sometimes just getting in our own way and falling in our own traps, literally. And the other is talking about this great need that we have, um, you know, this great need for love and community. And then finally, what if God turned around and gave us a big wet kiss? what would happen then? We'd be reciting poetry all day, inebriated, rogue poems we would be reciting. So I think these last three are satisfying on many levels, and they're definitely short. And each one has at least one, maybe more jolts, hits of surprises where you just get caught. Remember my mentor poet for many, many years, William Stafford, used to say that a poem is any language that has a stop and pay attention. You know, someone wrote me a note recently and they said, I've tried to love poetry. I've tried to love poetry. But can you suggest some poems? I really have tried, he said. And I thought to myself, I did. I wrote a note back to him because just the idea that I've tried to love poetry almost implies, he didn't say it exactly, but it almost implies a should, like you should love poetry or you should do this around that. And I don't think there's any shoulds in poetry. Poems need to hold their own. They need to be able to hold their own weight. They need to need to live outside of what I used to call, or what I still call, the hothouse environment of a literature class, where you are assigned these poems and you're supposed to read the canon, and you will enjoy these poems and you will analyze them. Well, that's not my attitude. I know many, many teachers that do that or did that have very good intentions and probably love the poetry themselves. It's just that if we teach it that way as a should, as a responsibility, as a way to get a good grade, you just take all the joy out of poetry. And I think that poetry has so much joy, it's so many things on a practical level that it can help us do, from remembering to grieving to loving to celebrating, to appreciating. All these things I think that poetry can do for us. If we can find the poems we love, if we cannot should on ourselves, as the old saying goes, don't make yourself feel like you've got to do anything. Just, the poems you love, go for those. Yeah, that'd be my basic advice. Okay, that's a wrap. And as I always say, thank you so much for your listening ear. If you feel like making a comment wherever you hear this, or on YouTube, or if it's on one of the podcast sites, if you feel like making a comment, that would be great. A like would be wonderful on YouTube or any of the other places, because it helps me get the word out a little bit more. If there's somebody that you think would enjoy these podcasts, please, send it to them. And that would be great. That's another way to get the word out. So thank you again so much for your listening ear. And as I always say, until next time and next poems, take good care of yourself.